Yeah, thank you very much for your time today, and thank you very much for your interest in the report, and more importantly, your interest in the Vietnam market. I'm delighted to see the attendance today and the enthusiasm. Thank you for your kind introductions, and maybe I could share my screen to get going. Okay, can you confirm that you can see my screen?
It's okay.
Okay, fantastic. Over the last 6 months, we have worked with the Italian Embassy to explore opportunities for Italian businesses in Vietnam and create a snapshot of the current business landscape in Vietnam and highlight specific areas where we think there may be opportunity for Italian companies going forward. In our report, we first look at the macro situation of the Vietnam market, identifying a few key areas where we see as drivers for the business environment going forward. And then we dive into a list of specific sectors that we think are of most importance to the Italian community. Now, I believe the report is already live. The report is more than 80 pages long, so obviously we can't cover all of it today. Over the next 20 or so minutes, I would like to highlight some of the key findings of the report, but I greatly encourage you to go online and download the report for yourself for your weekend reading coming up. So first, a little bit of an introduction to the Vietnam market. Before we talk about the specifics of the Vietnam market, I would like to touch a little bit about the COVID impact in Vietnam. COVID has impacted the global markets around the world, and Vietnam is, unfortunately, particularly now with the current outbreak, without exception. But we think that Vietnam will be one of the fastest markets in the world to recover, because in 2020, we didn't actually dip into a recession. We were one of the few markets around the world and in Asia that did not dip into a recession. Here you can see on this graph, the gray lines are the ASEAN markets and the red line is Vietnam, just to highlight that in 2020, we stayed positive, and we believe in 2021, we will regain our position as one of the fastest growing markets going forward. Now, in our report, we highlight 6 key areas in a lot more detail than we'll be able to go over today, but we would just like to highlight them here today with you. One is the shifting composition of Vietnam from a rural market to an urban market, so the urbanization of Vietnam. Then the overall growth of the market from the current GDP growth and the change in composition of the economy. Then the changing composition of Vietnam's population and its growing labor force. And then the population of Vietnam, how the consumer base of Vietnam is rapidly changing from a manufacturing base to also a addressable consumer base. Then investment and trade. First, looking at investment growth into the country, and then touching briefly on trade. Now, in the introductions, we just talked a little bit about the trade agreements. We'll highlight those, but that is a very exciting topic, and I encourage you to read more on those. Vietnam's population, as many of you are aware, is approximately 100 million people. That splits about 30 to 70%, 35-61 currently, urban versus rural. Vietnam is one of the quickest urbanizing countries in the world. Here you can see Vietnam's urbanization growth just as it compares to other Southeast Asian countries, as Vietnam is the fastest, aside from some very small markets such as Laos. Now, diving into the GDP itself, as we just talked about, Vietnam was one of the few markets to achieve positive GDP growth in the COVID year, and we think coming out of COVID, it will regain its position as the fastest growing market in Southeast Asia, while maintaining a stable inflation rate. But what about the composition of the economy? How is the composition of the economy changing? And we go into this a lot more detail in the report. But what's very interesting that happened in 2018 or so is that the tertiary sector, or the services sector, now is the above 50% of the total economic output of Vietnam, and that is growing. And as you can see, the tertiary sector of the economy is growing at a 13% and expected to grow at a healthy 11% going forward. When you zoom into the actual population, you see that Vietnam, its services sector and its consumption sector are growing very quickly. I'm sorry about the formatting here. The header, legend went up top. But if you compare the historical per capita growth rate of Vietnam of 2014 to 19 for gross income, you see that Vietnam is more similar to China as a growth story than other Southeast Asian countries. And then if you look at consumption expenditures or individual consumption expenditures, so the consumer market of Vietnam, you see that Vietnam is actually growing faster than China historically, and looking forward into the next 5 years. Vietnam is expected to outpace China, though of course at a much smaller per capita basis. This growth in consumer markets is driving investment into the country. Over the last 5 years, inbound foreign direct investment has maintained an over 11% growth rate. This investment has been dominated by other Asian countries such as South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan. In the last 5 years alone, we've seen a registered FDI grow from 24 billion to almost $40 billion. Manufacturing and industrial processing dominates these numbers, as you can see on the right side. Looking briefly into trade, as was mentioned at the very beginning of this conversation today, Vietnam has formed many very important free trade agreements with foreign countries, among which, and probably most important of which, is the European-Vietnam Free Trade Agreement. As well, the framework agreement for the comprehensive and progressive trade agreement, the CPTPP, which is currently being rolled out, is also an exciting development that should be watched carefully. What we're seeing for Vietnam is not only now an addressable market for European countries, but is also an entrance into the ASEAN region. Vietnam is, for a lot of our European clients, a gateway now. Because of the European Union Vietnam Free Trade Agreement, European companies can now enter into the country without tariff, add value in the country through manufacturing, and then re-export into the ASEAN region. Because of these favorable trade policies, we're seeing a growth in the trade balance. As you can see, and as early as 2009, 10, 11, Vietnam was a net importer, meaning that it bought more stuff than it sold. Then, particularly recently, because of the trade agreements, this has rapidly changed. And Vietnam now is becoming a hub for manufacturing and export for not only Asia, but the world. Here we've touched on a few of the key commodities that are driving this trend. We go into this in the report in a lot more detail, but I would encourage you to look into that. In the report, we highlight that the composition of trade has quickly changed from agricultural products, such as coffee and cashew nuts, into high-end manufacturing around apparel and worn goods, and then even into broadcast equipments and telephones. It should be noted that the majority of Samsung's phones now are manufactured here in Vietnam, along with Google and other products. So Vietnam is definitely moving up the manufacturing value chain. So what does this all mean for Italy and Italian companies? In our report, we, in collaboration with the embassy, dove into a few sectors to identify what is the current state of these sectors, these sectors of critical importance to Italy and Italian companies, and what are some key areas that might be opportunities for investment for Italian companies. Now, again, our report is about 80 pages long, so we have a lot of analysis, and we can't possibly cover it all here today, but I would like to highlight a few of the key interesting findings with you today, and then encourage you to go and read on your own. In our report, we zoomed in on 8 key sectors of importance for Italian companies: apparel and footwear, cars, food and beverage, pharmaceuticals, education, renewable energy, furniture, and tourism. Now, in each of these sectors, and wherever possible, we looked at not only the consumption, but the manufacturing, and also even the equipment that's required to make these industries possible, because we know that Italian companies are an important part of the global supply chain, not only for the raw ingredients such as apparel and fabrics, but also the equipment that makes these industries possible. So let's dive in with apparel and fabrics. So as you can see, Vietnam here on the left side is actually one of the largest consumers of Italian fabrics in Southeast Asia, and growing quickly at a 9% compound annual growth rate. On the right side, you can see that growth rate is dominated by fabrics, though animal hides is the largest quantity, largest value category for those inputs. Now that makes sense considering that Vietnam is a main supplier of main manufacturer of shoes, apparel, and furniture for not only the region but the world. Looking into the machinery, this is quite interesting. On the left side, you see the export value of Italian machines for apparel, growing at 15%. So although it's smaller than other markets such as Thailand, it's rapidly catching up and is one of the fastest growing markets for this in the region. Leather machinery dominates, which makes sense considering that Vietnam is consolidating its footprint as a manufacturing hub for shoes and other apparel categories. Let's transition into automotive. The automotive story for Vietnam is very exciting. If you graph the car penetration rate globally against income per capita, it forms this very interesting, almost 45-degree angle with a direct correlation between the amount of money people have and the cars they own, which makes perfect sense. So, and this is interesting not just for Asia, but it's a similar pattern everywhere in the world you look, with some exceptions. Vietnam is on the bottom left side. The auto industry in Vietnam is in its early days, but is growing quickly. Based on our projections for income per capita, when Vietnam turns into a middle-income country in 2032, its car penetration rate will be more than 5 times what it is now, meaning that Vietnam will have 5 times as many cars on the road. So that means the car production will be, the car consumption sales should be 5 times what they are currently. This will open up opportunities for Italian suppliers, both in terms of the cars themselves, but also for the domestic manufactured cars, as Italy produces many of the complex components and machinery that are required in automobile manufacturing. The auto market over the last 5 years, from 2014, 6 years, has grown at a compound annual growth rate of 26%. Cars of import of origin, Thailand as everybody is likely aware, is a major manufacturing hub for Southeast Asia for cars, for companies such as Toyota. But it should be noted that Vietnam is also growing its domestic manufacturing of cars. Let's dive into one of my favorite topics, food and beverage. Now, food and beverage, when compared to other ASEAN countries, may seem underpenetrated for Vietnam. Here we can see that when stacked against ASEAN peer countries, Vietnam, Italian products in Vietnam are the lowest ranked, but Vietnam is one of the fastest growing markets. Take a look at wine consumption. Italian wine consumption in Vietnam has grown at a compound annual growth rate of almost 50% over the last 5 years. That's quite interesting. Please note that for this report, some latest data points are 2018 and other points are 2019. We apologize for this, but that's just because of the complexity in the data, and we are using the most available data we have, most current data we have. Zooming in on wine, pasta, and edible oils, which are of obvious importance to the Italian market, we can see that in all three, Vietnam is in its early days, but is one of the fastest growing markets, if not the fastest growing markets, in all three categories for Southeast Asia. So we think that there is great potential going forward, particularly for wine. I, for one, consume a lot of it. Now, like I said at the start, in each of the industries in our report, we, where possible, tried to identify not only just the commodity that is being consumed, but also the machinery that's required to manufacture the commodity. Here, we look at both the export of European industrial food productions by country in Europe, and the right side, the import into Vietnam. So, key takeaway here is that Italy is obviously one of the key manufacturers and exporters of food production machinery. And if you look at Vietnam, the growth rate for the importation of food preparation equipment from Italy leads Southeast Asia at 52% over the last 5 years. Transitioning over into the pharmaceutical industry, this is a very interesting story for Vietnam. Just like the auto industry, there is a very predictable curve of income per capita to pharmaceutical sales. But Vietnam seems to be breaking the mold a little bit. As you can see, as Vietnam is far further to the right side of the screen than its peer markets, compared with income per capita, Vietnam is consuming more pharmaceuticals on a per capita basis than you would expect. Zooming into why this might be, there are a few key points to consider. One is the changing composition of Vietnam's healthcare industry. Vietnam, like many emerging markets countries, is transitioning from a communicable disease market to a non-communicable disease market. That means that conditions such as cancer, diabetes, heart conditions are becoming more prevalent, and those conditions require long-term care. That long-term care is quite expensive. As you can see in the middle graph, Vietnam spends 6% of its GDP on healthcare products, which is the highest of any Southeast Asian country, which is driving a 10% compound annual growth rate of drugs for the market. And we think that 10% growth rate will continue going forward. Italian products within that 10% are well represented. On the left side, as everybody knows, Italy is one of the key manufacturers of pharmaceuticals globally and growing. On the right side, you can see that Vietnam is one of the key markets, destinations for Italian-made pharmaceutical products. Education. When people think of the Italian market as a destination market, two key things jump to mind. One is education and two is tourism. And we've included both of them in our report. Now, here we have a breakdown of just an overview of the education sector in Vietnam. As you can see, the dark purple color is the public sector and the light blue color is the private sector. Now, obviously, like in most markets, the public sector dominates in education, but the private sector is growing very rapidly, particularly for the high school and below. Zooming into the breakdown of the industry, we for this report, we went a little bit extra further, and we actually did a revenue pool analysis to look at what the size of the market is for education. And as you can see, that on a revenue basis, private education is growing very quickly at between 11 and 13%, as you can see on the far right side, and has a total value of $2.6 billion. This is expected to continue going forward, dominated by K through 12 education. Renewable energies. Italy obviously has some of the most sophisticated equipment for managing power distribution and regulation. Vietnam is a market in need of technology for renewables. Here we could see on the bar charts, total electricity consumption versus GDP. As you can see, the GDP of Vietnam is growing at about 7% and will continue to grow somewhere between 6 and 7% going forward. However, energy consumption is considerably outpacing economic activity, growing at 10%. And total peak demand, which is one of the key metrics when forecasting for energy consumption, is growing even faster at almost 11%. This means that Vietnam will need to create new energy sources. As we talk about in detail in our report, Vietnam has put a moratorium or a block on future coal-fired power plants. Therefore, it will need to get its energy from other sources, such as wind, solar, and hydro. Most of the easy-to-access hydropower plants have already been built. That leaves wind and solar, which we are seeing as an attractive investment opportunity for foreign investors such as Italian companies. Furniture industry. Vietnam is becoming both a consumer of furniture as it emerges into a middle-class country as an addressable market, and a major exporter of furniture to the world, importing the raw materials and exporting the finished goods. As you can see, Vietnam, the importation of European furniture into Vietnam is growing the fastest in Southeast Asia, though it's still considerably behind Singapore and even behind Thailand. Looking at Italian furniture, though, you can see that Vietnam is the fastest growing destination market for Italian furniture in Southeast Asia, though again, relatively small compared to Singapore, but growing very rapidly. And tourism. One cannot talk about Italy without bringing up tourism. Italy is one of the places I miss the most in this current pandemic world. And I'm very excited to see that Vietnamese people are venturing out into Europe and Italy. In our report, we've tried to track the applications for visas of Vietnamese people going into Europe and Italy. As you can see, that looking backwards from 2014 to 19, just right before the pandemic, Vietnamese applied for Schengen visas at an 83% compound annual growth rate, growing from a small number to a considerable number, from almost almost nothing, of 3,000 applications to 64,000 applications. Now, the forecast is anybody's guess at this time. When will the borders open up? When will Vietnam have access to sufficient quantities of vaccine to be able to export its tourists to the rest of the world again? These are all critical questions that we are all waiting for good answers. But one thing is for sure, that when things open up again, Vietnamese people will be going to Europe. And when they go to Europe, Italy will surely be on the top of their list. That concludes my little section. I very much encourage you to read our report in full. There's lots of information there that we do not have time to talk about today. I would also encourage you to reach out to the Embassy of Italy in Hanoi. They are happy to talk to you, and if I could be of any help in your consideration of the Vietnamese market, please feel free to include me in those conversations. KPMG is more than happy to have those conversations. So with that, I will hand it back over to the host. Thank you very much.